Everyone ignored the 3 homeless children sitting outside St. Catherine's private hospital. Some people slowed down long enough to stare. A few dropped coins into the paper cup beside them without asking why they were there. Others pulled their coats tighter, lowered their heads, and hurried through the hospital's revolving glass doors, as if looking directly at the children might make their suffering contagious. But nobody stopped. That was the part Grace Bennett would remember most clearly, not the bitter November wind sweeping through the streets of London, not the hunger twisting inside her stomach, not even the fever burning through her younger sister's body. It was the shoes. Hundreds of polished shoes passing within inches of where they sat beneath the hospital's narrow entrance canopy. Leather shoes belonging to doctors. High heels belonging to visitors carrying flowers. Trainers belonging to people leaving with discharge papers and grateful families. Every pair arrived, passed them, and disappeared. Grace was 8 years old. She sat with her back against the cold stone wall, holding a transparent plastic bag containing a pair of worn brown shoes. They belonged to her mother, her triplet brother. Gabriel stood near the entrance with a faded photograph raised against his chest. "Excuse me," he said whenever someone approached. "Have you seen this woman?" Most people pretended not to hear. Their sister, Glory, lay curled beneath a thin gray blanket with her head resting on Grace's lap. Her small body trembled despite the heat radiating from her skin. "Grace," Glory whispered, "I'm cold." "I know. Is Mom coming today?" Grace looked toward the hospital doors. Their mother had walked through those doors 18 days earlier. She had never walked out. "Yes," Grace said, because sometimes an older sister's job was not to tell the truth. Sometimes it was to give hope enough time to become true. "She'll come." A security guard stepped outside. He had removed them twice that week, but they always returned. At first, his voice had contained something resembling sympathy. That sympathy had thinned with every encounter until only irritation remained. "You 3 cannot stay here." Gabriel lowered the photograph. "We're waiting for our mother." "You've been told there is no patient by that name." "She works here," Grace said. The guard looked at her. "The hospital has checked its employment records. She cleaned the rooms on the 6th floor. There is no record of a Naomi Bennett working at this hospital." Grace tightened her grip around the plastic bag. "Then why did she leave her shoes?" The guard glanced at the worn brown shoes but did not answer. Their mother never went anywhere without them. She said expensive shoes were an argument between feet and pride, and she had no time for arguments she could avoid. On the morning she disappeared, a hospital receptionist had called Grace from Naomi's telephone. The woman said their mother had collapsed during her shift and was being treated. The triplets had rushed to St. Catherine's with their neighbor. By the time they arrived, the hospital denied making the call. It denied that Naomi worked there. It denied that she had been admitted. Then a cleaner found the shoes in a staff changing room and quietly handed them to Grace before refusing to say anything else. The children had returned every day since. Their neighbor eventually stopped bringing them. Then the landlord changed the locks on their flat because the rent had not been paid. The council promised emergency placement, but the only available arrangement would separate Gabriel from his sisters. The triplets ran before the social worker could take them. They had spent 6 nights sleeping near the hospital because it was the last place they knew their mother had been alive. The security guard reached for the blanket. "Come on, you need to move." Gabriel stepped between him and Glory. "Don't touch her." "I am not going to hurt her." "She's sick," Grace said. "Then take her to a public emergency department." Grace stared at the enormous building behind him. "This is a hospital. This is a private facility." The words were spoken without cruelty. That almost made them worse. Grace looked down at Glory. Her sister's lips were dry, and her breathing had become fast and shallow. Please, Grace said. Just let a doctor look at her. The guard hesitated. Behind him, a hospital administrator appeared in the doorway. Julian Mercer wore a charcoal suit, a silver tie, and the strained expression of a man whose carefully organized morning had been interrupted by something untidy. What is happening? They're refusing to leave, the guard explained. Mercer looked at the children, then at the line of black vehicles turning into the hospital driveway. His expression changed immediately. Move them now. Our donor has arrived. The convoy consisted of 5 black SUVs. It moved with such quiet precision that the traffic seemed to rearrange itself around it. The lead vehicle stopped directly in front of the hospital steps. Inside the second SUV, Seo Min-jae barely looked up from the financial report on his tablet. At 39, Min-jae had become a man whom newspapers described as a reclusive Korean shipping magnate and whom London's criminal underworld described far more carefully. He controlled warehouses, private security companies, and freight routes connecting 3 continents. Some of those businesses were legitimate. Others existed in the space between what authorities suspected and what they could prove. People called him ruthless because it was easier than admitting that he was disciplined. Ruthlessness sounded emotional. Seo Min-jae had not allowed himself the luxury of emotion in years. Mr. Seo, his security chief said from the front seat, Dr. Harcourt and the board are waiting. Min-jae reached to close the report. Then, through the rain-speckled window, he saw a little boy standing with both arms stretched out, attempting to stop a security guard from reaching 2 girls beneath a blanket. The hospital administrator said something. The guard pulled the blanket. The smallest girl rolled weakly onto her back. Min-jae saw the unnatural redness in her face. He saw her chest rising too quickly. He saw the other girl press a hand against her forehead and become suddenly afraid. Stop, he said. The driver looked in the mirror. Sir, stop the convoy. We've arrived. I can see that. Min-jae opened the door before anyone could reach it. The cold rain struck his black coat as he crossed the pavement. Hospital security immediately stepped aside. Grace noticed what happened before she noticed the man himself. Adults moved for him. Not reluctantly. Not after being asked twice. They moved because something in his stillness made disobedience feel like a decision with consequences. The man stopped in front of the children. He was tall, with neatly combed black hair, sharp features, and an expression that revealed nothing. 2 security officers stood several feet behind him, scanning the street. Grace wrapped both arms around Glory. We're leaving, she said quickly. Min-jae looked at the sick child. How long has she had the fever? Grace said nothing. He removed his gloves. I'm not going to hurt her. That's what people say before they decide what happens to us. Min-jae studied the child who had said it. Then he did something nobody expected. He sat down on the wet pavement. His security chief stared at him. The hospital administrator appeared horrified. Passing visitors slowed down, suddenly fascinated by the same children they had ignored moments earlier. Min-jae did not look at any of them. Sitting brought him level with Grace. My name is Min-jae, he said. What is hers? Grace hesitated. Glory. And yours? Grace. Gabriel lowered his arms, but remained standing between Min-jae and his sisters. That's Gabriel, Grace said. Min-jae touched the back of 2 fingers to Glory's forehead. The child did not resist. She was too weak. His expression changed almost imperceptibly. She needs a doctor now. Grace looked toward the hospital entrance. They said she isn't their kind of patient. Min-jae lifted his gaze to Julian Mercer. For the first time that morning, the hospital administrator appeared to understand that he had made a serious mistake. Min-jae returned his attention to Grace. Why are you sitting outside this hospital? Grace held up the plastic bag. Our mother came inside 18 days ago, and the hospital says she was never here. Min-jae looked at Naomi's shoes. Then he looked at Gabriel's photograph. Something inside him went very still. He had once asked that same hospital what had happened to someone he loved. They had given him records, signatures, and explanations. They had given him everything except the truth. "Please," Gabriel said, holding the photograph closer. "Can you find her?" Min-jae stared at the three children. His convoy was waiting. The hospital board was waiting. A multi-million-pound agreement that had taken 8 months to negotiate was waiting upstairs. But the child on the pavement might not have another hour to wait. "Yes," he said. "But first, we help your sister." If this is your first time here, subscribe and follow this story to the end, because the reason St. Catherine's had erased Naomi Bennett would force one of London's most feared men to reopen the tragedy that had haunted him for 11 years. Hit the like button and tell me your city and country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. 3 weeks earlier, Naomi Bennett had stood alone inside a restricted records room on the 6th floor of St. Catherine's private hospital, staring at the name of a dead woman. The problem was that the woman was not dead. Naomi knew because she had spoken to her less than an hour earlier. For 6 years, Naomi had worked nights at St. Catherine's. She emptied bins, disinfected examination rooms, and cleaned spaces occupied by people who rarely looked at her long enough to remember her face. She did not resent them for it. Invisibility had its advantages. People discussed confidential matters while she changed their bedding. Doctors left files open because they assumed the cleaner could not understand them. Administrators held conversations in corridors and stopped noticing when she passed. Naomi noticed everything. For several weeks, she had noticed patients being moved from the 6th floor after midnight. Their doors would be empty by morning. Their names vanished from the ward list. Staff were told they had been transferred, but no ambulances arrived, and no official transport records existed. Then Naomi met Miriam Adeyemi. Miriam was a 53-year-old Nigerian woman admitted for complications following a routine procedure. She had no family in Britain and spoke to Naomi because they shared the kind of immediate familiarity sometimes created by a common accent far from home. On Naomi's next shift, Miriam's room was empty. The ward supervisor said she had died, but Naomi found Miriam alive in a restricted recovery suite, sedated and restrained beneath another patient's name. The electronic file listed Miriam Adeyemi as deceased at 2:14 that morning. Naomi photographed the screen. Then she found 17 more names. The records showed that each patient had agreed to participate in an experimental drug program. The consent forms carried signatures. Several belonged to patients who could not read English. 2 belonged to people medically incapable of giving consent. Someone was using vulnerable patients for unauthorized clinical trials. Naomi copied everything she could onto a small memory card and hid it inside the lining of her work bag. She intended to leave quietly. She nearly reached the staff exit. Then a voice came through the dark corridor behind her. "Mrs. Bennett." Naomi stopped. Dr. Adrian Harcourt, the hospital's celebrated medical director, stood beneath the emergency light. His white coat was perfectly clean. His hands rested calmly in his pockets. "You've been somewhere you shouldn't," he said. Naomi turned slowly. "I was cleaning." "No," Harcourt replied. "You were looking." 18 days later, Grace sat beside Glory's hospital bed while a medical team worked around her. Min-jae stood behind the glass, watching. Dr. Harcourt had offered the hospital's finest private suite the moment he realized who was sitting with the children. Min-jae declined it and ordered Glory treated in the nearest emergency room instead. Gabriel stood beside him, still holding their mother's photograph. "You said you would find her." "I did. Adults say things when children are crying. Min-jae looked down at him. Gabriel's eyes were frightened, but his voice was steady. I am not saying it because you are crying. Then why? Min-jae looked through the glass at Grace, holding her sister's hand. Because this hospital has lied to me before. Across the corridor, Julian Mercer quietly made a telephone call. The children are inside, he whispered. Seo Min-jae is with them. The person on the other end asked a question. Mercer glanced toward the emergency room. No, he said. I don't think he knows what their mother found. He listened. Then his face lost color. All three of them. Another pause. Mercer lowered his voice further. I understand. He ended the call. Inside the treatment room, Glory opened her eyes and whispered one sentence to Grace. Mom was afraid of the room with no windows. Grace froze. She had never heard Glory say those words before. On the other side of the glass, Min-jae watched Grace's expression change. And somewhere beneath St. Catherine's Hospital, behind a door that did not appear on any official floor plan, a woman heard 3 names spoken through a security officer's radio. Grace, Gabriel, Glory. Naomi Bennett opened her eyes. She did not move. Movement attracted attention, and attention inside the windowless room usually brought questions she no longer had the strength to answer. She lay on a narrow medical bed beneath a thin white sheet. A cannula entered the back of her left hand. Adhesive patches covered her chest, connecting her to a monitor whose steady green light had become the only reliable way to measure time. There was no clock, no sunlight, no sound from the outside world except footsteps, rolling trolleys, and the occasional conversation transmitted through the radio of the guard stationed beyond her door. But she had heard the names clearly. Grace, Gabriel, Glory. Her children were inside St. Catherine's. For 18 days, Naomi had endured one thought above all others, that the hospital had found them. She had refused to reveal where she had hidden the memory card. Dr. Harcourt threatened her job, her freedom, and eventually her children. When threats failed, he began administering experimental medication under the pretense of treating a psychiatric episode. The records now identified her as Nora Blake, an unidentified homeless woman admitted in a confused state. Naomi Bennett no longer officially existed, but her children had come looking for her, and somehow Seo Min-jae had come with them. Naomi closed her eyes. She knew that name. Everyone employed at St. Catherine's knew it, though few spoke it aloud. Seo Min-jae was one of the hospital's largest private donors. His logistics company transported specialist medical equipment across Europe. His foundation had financed the new research wing. But 11 years earlier, his younger sister had entered St. Catherine's for what should have been a routine treatment. She died before sunrise. The official report blamed an unexpected cardiac reaction. Naomi had recently found another file carrying her name. Seo Ji-yun, patient 001, the first name in the trial program. Naomi opened her eyes again. If Min-jae was truly upstairs, then the hospital's oldest secret had just walked through its front door. Upstairs, Dr. Adrian Harcourt crossed the emergency department with the measured confidence of a man accustomed to being welcomed into every room he entered. At 58, Harcourt had built his reputation from prestigious awards, televised interviews, and carefully photographed charity work. His face appeared on medical journals. His name was attached to research grants and university buildings. He stopped outside Glory's treatment room and offered Min-jae a concerned smile. Mr. Seo, I came as soon as I heard. Min-jae did not shake his hand. What is wrong with the child? Harcourt looked through the glass. The preliminary assessment suggests pneumonia complicated by exposure and exhaustion. She is responding to treatment. Will she recover? I believe so. That wasn't the question. Harcourt's smile tightened. Yes, she should recover. Gabriel stood beside Min-jae. The top of his head barely reached the man's elbow, but he watched Harcourt with the same alert stillness. Our mother worked here, Gabriel said. Harcourt looked down as though noticing him for the first time. What is your mother's name? Naomi Bennett. There was no visible reaction. That was what Min-jae noticed. An innocent man might have looked confused. A guilty man might have looked afraid. Harcourt showed, neither, because he had prepared himself for this name long before Gabriel spoke it. I'm afraid I don't recognize it, Harcourt said. You employ more than 2,000 people, Min-jae replied. I wouldn't expect you to. Our Human Resources Department can check. They already did. They claim she never worked here. Then perhaps the children are mistaken about the hospital. Gabriel raised the photograph. She wore that uniform. Naomi stood in front of St. Catherine's in the picture, smiling in navy blue cleaning scrubs. Part of the hospital's gold crest was visible behind her shoulder. Harcourt studied it briefly. Uniforms can be acquired. Gabriel's fingers tightened around the photograph. Min-jae watched Harcourt. An 8-year-old girl is receiving treatment because your employees left her outside. That is deeply regrettable. Her mother disappeared inside your building. That is an allegation. It is a question, Min-jae said. You should hope I continue asking it politely. The corridor became very quiet. Harcourt looked toward the 2 security officers behind Min-jae. Then he lowered his voice. You came here today to finalize an important agreement. I suggest we move upstairs and discuss this privately. The agreement is suspended. A flicker passed through Harcourt's eyes. Our research expansion depends upon your transport network. I know. Millions have already been committed. Then you understand how expensive dishonesty is about to become. Min-jae entered Glory's treatment room and closed the door. Grace sat beside her sister's bed. Glory's breathing had slowed beneath the oxygen mask. Color was returning gradually to her lips. A nurse adjusted the intravenous line and left without meeting anyone's eyes. Min-jae remained near the door. Grace looked at him. Is she going to die? No, you don't know that. The doctor said she will recover. The hospital also said Mum wasn't here. Min-jae had no answer that would not insult the child's intelligence. So he gave her the truth. I believe your sister is receiving the correct treatment. I do not believe the people controlling this hospital are telling us everything about your mother. Grace looked down at Glory. Why would they hide her? That is what I intend to discover. Why do you care? The question was direct, but it was not ungrateful. Grace had learned that unexplained kindness often arrived with conditions, and she wanted to see the conditions before agreeing to them. Min-jae glanced at the photograph in Gabriel's hands. My sister died here 11 years ago. Was she sick? She was receiving treatment. Did they lie about her too? Min-jae was silent for a moment. I never proved it. Grace studied him. Maybe you stopped looking. The words struck precisely because she had not meant them cruelly. Min-jae had spent 11 years telling himself he had searched everywhere. He had hired investigators, bribed hospital employees, and threatened officials. He had collected records until a locked cabinet inside his study could no longer hold them. But eventually, power demanded his attention. Grief became routine. The hospital's explanations remained professionally consistent, and Min-jae accepted the version of events he hated because hating it required less from him than continuing to hope it was false. Perhaps he had stopped looking. Yes, he said. Maybe I did. Grace's expression softened by a degree. Then we can look for both of them. Min-jae looked at her. She had nothing, no home, no money, no adult willing to believe her. Yet she had said, we, as if she were offering him something. And perhaps she was. By late afternoon, Glory was stable enough to sleep without the oxygen mask. Min-jae arranged for all 3 children to remain together in a private recovery apartment owned by his company. He refused the hospital's offer of accommodation. Grace refused his offer entirely. "We're not going anywhere until we find Mom. You cannot sleep outside. We did before. That does not make it acceptable. If we leave, they might move her." Min-jae crouched beside her chair. "I am assigning people to every exit. Nobody will be moved from this building without my knowledge. How do I know your people won't lie?" "You don't." Grace appeared surprised by the answer. "You will have to watch what I do," Min-jae continued, "and decide based on that." Gabriel stepped closer. "Can we stay together?" "Yes." "No different rooms?" "One apartment. 3 beds." Grace looked at Glory, then at Gabriel. "We want that written down." Min-jae almost smiled. "Of course you do." That evening, his security chief, Kang Dae-sung, arrived with clean clothes, food, and a laptop. Dae-sung was 44, broad-shouldered, and permanently unimpressed by circumstances that would have unsettled most people. He had worked beside Min-jae for 13 years and had seen him respond to betrayal, gunfire, and international investigations with less personal involvement than he had shown toward 3 children in one afternoon. "You missed the board meeting," Dae-sung said. "I was aware of that. Our partners in Busan are asking whether the agreement is dead. It is suspended. Because of the children? Because St. Catherine's may be hiding illegal activity inside a facility, our company services." Dae-sung glanced through the glass at the triplets. "So because of the children." Min-jae closed the treatment room door behind them. "Find Naomi Bennett. I started an hour ago. And she worked here for 6 years through a subcontracted cleaning company. Her employee profile was deleted 13 days ago, but the payroll system retained fragments. Her last payment was 18 days ago, the day she disappeared." Dae-sung nodded. Her home address was accessed by someone using hospital administrator credentials the following morning. Shortly afterwards, the landlord received the unpaid rent notice that led to the eviction. They engineered it. It appears so. Once the children lost the flat, social services would separate them and move them away from the hospital. Min-jae's jaw tightened. "What about security footage?" "Missing from the night Naomi disappeared. The hospital claims a system upgrade corrupted 6 hours of recordings. Convenient. There is something else." Dae-sung opened the laptop. A photograph appeared on the screen. It showed Naomi leaving the 6th-floor records room. The image was grainy, but clear enough to identify her. "Where did you get this?" "A backup server the hospital appears to have forgotten our logistics company installed." Min-jae examined the timestamp, 2:07 a.m. Dae-sung advanced to the next image. At 2:11 a.m., Dr. Harcourt entered the same corridor. At 2:19, 2 security officers escorted Naomi toward a service lift. At 2:26, the lift descended. But there is no basement level listed on the public plans, Dae-sung said. Min-jae remembered Glory's words. "The room with no windows. Get the original architectural plans. They will know we're looking." They already know. In the hospital apartment, Grace removed their mother's shoes from the plastic bag and placed them beside her bed. Gabriel set the photograph on the table. Glory watched them from beneath a thick blanket. "Mom told me something," she whispered. Grace sat beside her. "When?" "The last night at home." "What did she say?" Glory struggled to remember. "She said if anything happened, we should find the blue bird." Gabriel frowned. "What blue bird?" "I don't know." Grace picked up their mother's left shoe. Naomi had repaired the lining twice with dark thread. But near the heel was a new line of bright blue stitching. Grace pulled at it carefully. A small opening appeared inside the lining. Something hard rested beneath it. Gabriel helped tear the final thread, and a tiny memory card dropped into Grace's palm. On its surface, Naomi had drawn a bird in blue ink. The children stared at it. Then the apartment lights went out. The sudden darkness swallowed the room. Glory gasped. Gabriel moved immediately, placing himself between his sisters and the door. In the corridor outside, an electronic lock clicked open. Grace closed her fist around the memory card. Footsteps approached. Not hurried, not uncertain. Someone had known exactly where to find them. The door began to move. Then a hand caught it from the other side. A man grunted. Something struck the corridor wall. The door slammed shut again. 3 seconds later, emergency lights flickered on. Dae-sung stood outside with one arm pressed across a hospital security officer's throat. Another man lay face down near the lift while Min-jae's guards restrained him. Min-jae entered the apartment. His eyes moved across the children, counting them. Grace, Gabriel, Glory, all 3 unharmed. What happened? He asked. Grace slowly opened her hand. The memory card rested in her palm. They came for this. Min-jae looked at the blue bird drawn on its surface. Dae-sung dragged the captured officer into the room and removed the man's identification badge. It was not hospital security. It belonged to Min-jae's logistics company. Min-jae recognized the name immediately. The man had worked for him for 9 years. The hospital had not merely been using his business. Someone inside his organization had been protecting it. Hours later, in a secure office away from St. Catherine's network, Dae-sung opened the memory card. It contained patient lists, falsified consent forms, drug records, and videos Naomi had secretly recorded inside the restricted ward. Grace, Gabriel, and Glory sat together on the sofa, while Min-jae stood behind the desk. The first 17 files were horrifying. The 18th changed everything. Dae-sung opened it. A hospital record appeared bearing the date of Min-jae's sister's death. Patient name, Seo Min-jae. Approved trial subject, 001. Consent status, waived. Min-jae stopped breathing. The official report had claimed his sister suffered an unpredictable reaction to ordinary medication. This record showed something else. She had been deliberately given an experimental compound without her knowledge. At the bottom of the document were 2 authorization signatures. One belonged to Dr. Adrian Harcourt. The other belonged to the founder of the transport company that had secretly delivered the compound to St. Catherine's 11 years earlier. Seo Min-jae. His own name was on the paper. Grace looked from the screen to his face. You helped them. Min-jae stared at the signature. It was genuine. He remembered signing a collection of shipping authorizations during his first year in London. He had been building his organization, then moving anything profitable and asking few questions about what the sealed containers held. One of those containers had carried the drug that killed his sister. The room became unbearably quiet. Min-jae had spent 11 years believing St. Catherine's had taken Ji-yeon from him. He now understood that the hospital had only supplied the hand. He had delivered the weapon. Grace stood and took the memory card from the desk. Min-jae did not try to stop her. You said we could watch what you do, she said. Yes. So what are you going to do now? Before he could answer, Dae-sung's telephone rang. He listened for several seconds. His expression hardened. St. Catherine's has initiated an emergency evacuation of the restricted lower level. Min-jae turned toward him. How many patients? At least 12. And Naomi? Dae-sung looked at the children. They found a current photograph in an internal medical file. She is alive. Glory began to cry. Grace closed both hands around the memory card. Where are they taking her? Dae-sung's next words changed the room. They are not taking the patients anywhere. He looked at Min-jae. They have sealed the lower level, and initiated the hospital's fire suppression system. For 1 second, nobody moved. Grace did not understand what a fire suppression system could do to 12 patients sealed inside an underground ward. Min-jae did. Some medical storage areas used inert gas instead of water because sprinklers could destroy expensive equipment. Once activated, the system displaced oxygen from the room until a fire could no longer survive. Neither could anyone else. How long? Min-jae asked. Dae-sung checked the building schematic on his laptop. Full discharge in less than 6 minutes. Call emergency services. If we identify the lower level, Harcourt will know we have the files. He already knows. Min-jae turned toward his security team. Send every record on that memory card to our solicitor, 3 national newspapers, and the Metropolitan Police. Nobody receives the only copy. Dae-sung looked at him carefully. The records include your signature. I can see my name. If we release everything, the hospital will fall, but so will the protection around your transport network. Investigators will trace 11 years of shipments. Then they will have 11 years to investigate. Dae-sung held his gaze. Min-jae had built an empire around the principle that every loss should purchase something of greater value. Information purchased influence. Loyalty purchased security. Fear purchased obedience. But this decision would purchase nothing for him. It might cost his companies his freedom and the reputation he had spent years making untouchable. Min-jae looked at the 3 children. Grace was attempting not to cry because her brother and sister were watching. Gabriel stood close enough that his shoulder touched hers. Glory, weakened by pneumonia, clutched the blanket under her chin. Their mother had risked everything to leave them the truth. The least he could do was stop calculating how much truth would cost him. The fire suppression system beneath St. Catherine's Hospital had not been designed to save patients. It protected equipment. The restricted lower level contained experimental laboratories, pharmaceutical storage rooms, and servers holding research worth hundreds of millions of pounds. Water would destroy them. So the hospital had installed a gas-based system capable of removing enough oxygen from the sealed rooms to extinguish a fire without damaging the machinery. There was no fire. There were 12 patients, several of them sedated and unable to leave their beds. And Naomi Bennett was one of them. How long do they have? Min-jae asked. Dae-sung checked the building specifications on his laptop. Once the discharge begins, less than 8 minutes. Min-jae turned toward the door. Grace caught his sleeve. Our mother is down there. I know. You can't leave us here. I am not taking 3 children into a sealed medical laboratory. But you asked what I would do after learning the truth. Min-jae looked down at her. This is the first thing. He turned to Dae-sung. Send the files to Catherine. Catherine Cho was Min-jae's attorney and one of the few people who understood the complete architecture of his businesses. Everything? Dae-sung asked. Everything. The files include your signature. I know. They connect our transport network to illegal shipments going back more than a decade. I know that too. If this is released, the authorities will not distinguish between what you understood then and what you claim to understand now. They shouldn't. Grace watched him. For perhaps the first time since meeting Seo Min-jae, she did not see a feared man with cars, guards, and enough money to make adults move out of his way. She saw someone who had finally reached the place where excuses ended. Min-jae crouched in front of the triplets. Dae-sung will stay with you. Gabriel frowned. Isn't he your security chief? Yes. Then who will protect you? Min-jae looked toward the hospital visible through the office window. I have spent most of my life protecting myself. He stood. Tonight, I am protecting someone else. St. Catherine's looked peaceful from the street. Its windows glowed against the night. Ambulances continued arriving at the emergency entrance. Visitors crossed the lobby carrying flowers and cups of coffee, unaware that beneath them 12 people were being erased. Min-jae entered through the service corridor with 4 members of his security team. The hospital had locked the lifts and placed guards at the stairwell. Min-jae's men restrained them without gunfire. There was no time for threats or punishment. Only the next necessary door. Dae-sung guided them remotely using the original architectural plans. End of the corridor, his voice said through Min-jae's earpiece. Behind the linen storage room. Min-jae found a steel panel concealed behind empty shelves. There was no handle. He entered the access code taken from the captured officer's badge. The panel opened, revealing a narrow concrete staircase descending beneath the hospital. A mechanical voice sounded overhead. Oxygen reduction sequence commencing in 4 minutes. They moved faster. At the bottom of the stairs, they reached another security door. Min-jae pressed the stolen badge against the reader. A red light flashed. Access denied. Again. Access denied. Dae-sung's voice entered his ear. Harcourt has disabled every badge except his own. Min-jae looked through the reinforced glass. Beyond the door, 2 nurses were pulling desperately against the restraints on a patient's bed. A woman in the nearest room struck the glass weakly with her palm. Naomi. Her face was thinner than it had been in Gabriel's photograph, but Min-jae recognized her immediately. She pointed past him toward a red emergency box mounted on the wall. Min-jae broke the cover. Inside was a manual ventilation lever protected by a metal seal. He pulled it. Nothing happened. The mechanism had been disconnected. Oxygen reduction sequence commencing in 3 minutes. Min-jae stepped back from the door. The reinforced glass could withstand fire and impact, but every structure had a vulnerable point. He examined the frame, the hinges, and the electronic locking plate. Then he saw the exposed maintenance conduit running above it. Kill the power to this section, he told Dae-sung. The backup generator will activate. I need the delay between them. That gives you 6 seconds. It is enough. The lights went out. For 6 seconds, the lower corridor disappeared. The electronic lock released with a single mechanical click. Min-jae pulled the door open. Red emergency lights flickered on as the backup generator engaged. His team entered. They divided between the rooms, releasing patients and moving beds toward the stairwell. Several people could not walk. 2 were unconscious. 1 nurse had been locked inside after refusing to falsify treatment records. Min-jae reached Naomi. My children, she said before he could introduce himself. They're safe. Where? With my security chief. Her eyes sharpened despite the medication. St. Catherine's security? No, mine. Naomi studied his face. Seo Min-jae. Yes. Your sister. I found the file. I'm sorry. So, am I? The mechanical voice continued counting down. Min-jae lifted Naomi carefully from the bed. She was lighter than he expected. The movement pulled at the cannula in her hand, and she flinched. The others, she whispered. My people have them. All 12. He looked across the corridor. Beds were being pushed through the security door. A nurse supported an elderly man between both arms. One of Min-jae's guards carried a young woman who could no longer stand. All 12. The suppression system activated as the final patient reached the staircase. Behind them, heavy doors sealed the empty ward. A low hiss filled the corridor as oxygen was removed from rooms containing nothing St. Catherine's could still use as leverage. Naomi rested her head briefly against Min-jae's shoulder. They said nobody would look for me. Min-jae carried her upward. They underestimated your children. Police vehicles surrounded the hospital before Min-jae reached the main floor. Catherine Cho had done exactly what he instructed. She sent Naomi's files simultaneously to the Metropolitan Police, the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, and 3 investigative journalists. She also included Min-jae's transport records. There would be no private negotiation, no missing attachment, no single official who could bury the evidence. Truth survived best when too many people possessed it. Dr. Harcourt was found in the underground car park attempting to leave in a maintenance vehicle. Julian Mercer was arrested in his office while deleting patient files. Neither man understood that every deletion was being recorded on the backup server. They had spent years believing vulnerable people were easy to erase because vulnerability looked so much like powerlessness from a distance. They were not the same thing. Naomi was transferred to a public hospital. Grace, Gabriel, and Glory waited in a private family room, still wearing the clothes Daesung had brought them. When the door opened, they did not move at first. Naomi entered in a wheelchair, wrapped in a blue hospital blanket. Grace recognized her mother's hands before she recognized anything else. The same hands that braided Glory's hair. The same hands that checked Gabriel's homework and repaired Grace's school uniform when the sleeve tore. "Mom." Naomi opened her arms. All 3 children ran at once. Grace reached her first. Gabriel collided with the side of the wheelchair. Glory climbed onto her lap, despite the nurse warning them to be careful. Naomi held them as though she could return every stolen day through pressure alone. "I came back," she whispered. Grace buried her face against her shoulder. "No, we found you." Min-jae stood outside the doorway. He watched the 4 of them hold one another and felt the old instinct to leave before love reminded him of what he had lost. Then Glory looked over her mother's shoulder. "Aren't you coming?" Min-jae hesitated. "This is your family." Glory wiped her face. "You sat with us when nobody else would." The room became quiet. Naomi looked at him and extended one hand. It was not forgiveness. She did not know him well enough to offer that, and Min-jae had not earned it. It was simply an invitation not to stand alone in the hallway. He entered. The investigation into St. Catherine's lasted 14 months. 31 patients were identified as victims of unauthorized trials. 7 senior employees were charged. Dr. Harcourt received the longest sentence after Naomi's recordings proved he had personally approved the falsification of consent documents and ordered patients hidden under false identities. The hospital was placed under independent administration. Its experimental program was permanently closed. Min-jae's case was more complicated. His signature appeared on the original transport authorization, and his companies had delivered medical compounds without conducting the required checks. He did not claim ignorance as innocence. He surrendered financial records, testified against former partners, and accepted responsibility for the crimes his ambition had allowed him not to see. Several of his companies were dissolved. Others were placed under legal oversight. He lost money, influence, and the obedience that fear had once purchased. For the first time in years, he began gaining something he had never known how to build. A life he did not need to hide. Naomi recovered slowly. Some effects of the experimental medication lasted for months, but she returned home to her children. Not their old flat that had already been rented to another family. Min-jae offered them a house. Naomi refused. He offered again, more carefully. She refused again. Eventually, they agreed on a modest flat close to the children's school, rented through a legitimate victim support program, and not dependent on Min-jae's generosity. "You don't like accepting help," he observed. "I like knowing the difference between help and ownership," Naomi replied. Min-jae respected the distinction. He remained in their lives, not as a rescuer demanding gratitude, but as a man learning how to stay after the emergency ended. Every Thursday, he joined them for dinner. Gabriel taught him card games and accused him of cheating whenever he lost. Glory asked questions without warning, including whether Mafia bosses had bedtimes. Grace continued evaluating his promises. Naomi watched what he did. So did the children. 6 months after the hospital closed, Min-jae converted one of his legitimate office buildings into the Ji-yeon Patient Advocacy Center. It provided free legal and medical support to people who believed they had been mistreated by private healthcare institutions. Naomi joined its independent board only after confirming that Min-jae would have no authority over patient decisions. On opening day, Grace found him standing alone before a photograph of his sister. "She looks kind," Grace said. She was. "Do you still miss her?" "Every day." Grace nodded, as though this confirmed something she already understood. "You found out what happened?" "Yes." "Did it make you feel better?" Min-jae looked at the photograph. "No, but it made the grief honest." Grace slipped her hand into his. Across the room, Gabriel and Glory were arguing over which of them had first convinced him to stop the convoy. "It was me," Gabriel insisted. "I was standing in the road." "You didn't stop him," Glory replied. "I collapsed." "That isn't an achievement." "It worked." Naomi laughed. The sound reached Min-jae from across the room. 11 years earlier, he had left St. Catherine's convinced that losing one person meant allowing every door inside him to close. Then 3 homeless children sat outside the same hospital and refused to leave without their mother. Everyone else saw children with dirty clothes, an empty cup, and nowhere to sleep. Min-jae saw them too. The difference was that he sat down. And sometimes, changing a life does not begin with having the right words, enough money, or the power to fix everything. Sometimes it begins when one person refuses to keep walking. Grace squeezed his hand once before returning to her brother and sister. Min-jae remained beside Ji-yeon's photograph, surrounded by the ordinary noise of people who expected him to join them. This time, he did.